Two sisters rejected by all caregivers became the city's biggest challenge, until a woman sets a mysterious condition and nothing is ever the same again. The garden of the Mitchell mansion was impeccable that autumn morning. The fallen leaves had been carefully collected by the gardener before dawn, and the aroma of freshly planted dahlias filled the air with a sweetness that contrasted with the tension lingering within those walls. In the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, this was just one more of the imposing houses rising among the hills, with their high walls and elegant gates. To the neighbors, the Mitchell family was an example of discretion and refinement. Few knew what really happened behind that perfect facade. Edward Mitchell adjusted his tie in front of the hall mirror. At 42, his face already showed lines of expression that didn't exist 2 years ago. His work as CEO of one of Massachusetts' largest technology companies gave him prestige and considerable fortune, but it hadn't equipped him for what he faced. At home, his deep brown eyes reflected a weariness that went beyond the physical. "Good morning, sir," said Martha, the housekeeper, as she descended the stairs with a pile of sheets. "The new lady will arrive at 9, as arranged." Edward merely nodded, avoiding showing the skepticism he felt. 17 nannies in 6 months. None had withstood his daughters. Why would this one be different? "Are the girls awake yet?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Martha hesitated before answering, a sign that Edward knew well. "Yes, sir. They're busy in their room." "Busy? How?" The question came out harsher than intended. "They're drawing very quietly," replied the housekeeper, avoiding his gaze. Edward sighed. Quietness, in the language of that house, usually meant trouble. He climbed the stairs with heavy steps, mentally rehearsing the speech he would give his daughters. Something about respect, about appropriate behavior, about giving the new nanny a chance. The same words he had repeated 17 times before, without any result. The door to the twins' room was ajar. Olivia and Lauren, with their identical brown braids and navy blue dresses, were sitting on the plush carpet. At first glance they seemed absorbed in their drawings, but Edward knew that false innocence all too well. The small hands now holding colored pencils were the same ones that, the previous week, had put salt in the last nanny's coffee and spread permanent ink on her clothes. "Good morning, girls," said Edward, remaining at the threshold. Two identical pairs of eyes looked up to face him. There were no smiles, no hugs, none of the joy that used to characterize mornings 2 years ago. "Good morning, Dad," they answered in unison, with that unsettling synchronicity they had developed since Caroline had left. "A new nanny is coming today," he announced, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Her name is Mrs. Cindy, and she has excellent references." "Like the other 17?" asked Olivia, the more direct of the two, without taking her eyes off her drawing. "Will she cry like Simone did?" added Lauren, with a tone that mixed curiosity and satisfaction. Edward took a deep breath. They were just 8-year-old children, he repeated to himself like a mantra. Children dealing with a loss that even he, as an adult, couldn't fully process. "I'd like you to give her a chance," he said, trying to keep his voice firm. "She's not like the others." "That's what you said about Fernanda," commented Olivia. "And about Roberta and Denise and—" "Enough," interrupted Edward. "I'm not asking, I'm telling you. Behave, please." That final please revealed more than he would have liked. It revealed his exhaustion, his helplessness in his own home that seemed to have turned into a battlefield since Caroline's departure. He descended the stairs, feeling the weight of his failure as a father. The office would be his refuge for the next few minutes before the new nanny arrived. He needed to compose himself, needed to believe that this time would be different, even without knowing exactly why. At 9 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Edward took a deep breath before opening the door. The woman standing before him was nothing like he had imagined. She didn't have the youth and artificial enthusiasm of the latest candidates, nor the severe and antiquated aspect of the older ones. Mrs. Cindy, with her grey hair tied in a low bun and simple but impeccable clothes, conveyed a serenity that seemed out of place in that house for so long. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, with a voice firm and welcoming at the same time. "I'm Cynthia Thompson." "Please come in," replied Edward, opening the door wider. "Thank you for coming, especially considering the history." Mrs. Cindy entered the house with disconcerting familiarity, as if she already knew every corner. Her dark eyes, marked by fine expression lines, scanned the entrance hall, briefly pausing at the family portrait hanging on the wall. Edward, Caroline, and the twins, smiling in a time that seemed to belong to another life. "Beautiful family," she commented simply. "It was," replied Edward, before he could contain himself. "It still is," corrected Mrs. Cindy, without hesitation. "Just different now." Edward led her to the office, where they quickly reviewed the terms of the contract. Mrs. Cindy's conditions were, in fact, unusual. She wanted access to the entire house, including Caroline's room, which had remained untouched since the day of the tragedy. She wanted total authority during her shift, and above all, freedom to apply her methods, as long as she herself emphasized, they did not harm the children in any way. "Are you sure you want to take this position?" asked Edward, after explaining in detail his daughter's behavior in recent months. "I must warn you that the twins have been challenging." "Children always are," replied Mrs. Cindy with a slight smile, "especially when they're suffering. We've already tried therapists, psychologists, even a child psychiatrist. They refuse to talk. Perhaps they're waiting for someone who knows how to listen to what isn't being said," suggested the woman, with a tranquility that Edward couldn't comprehend. After signing the contract, Edward took her to see the house. Mrs. Cindy observed every detail with attention, as if she were collecting pieces of an invisible puzzle. In the kitchen, she noticed the sugar jar with a small label written "Caution Salt" in Martha's handwriting. In the second-floor corridor, she saw the small ink marks on the walls that cleaning attempts hadn't completely removed. In each room, there were traces of the small guerrilla warfare that the twins waged against adults who tried to approach them. "And what about the room?" asked Mrs. Cindy when they reached the end of the corridor in front of the only closed door. Edward felt a knot form in his throat. No one had entered there for almost 2 years. Not even he had the courage to face that space frozen in time. "I don't think it's necessary," he said, averting his gaze. "It's a condition," Mrs. Cindy gently reminded him. "If I'm going to help your daughters, I need to understand the whole house." Reluctantly, Edward took a small key ring from his pocket and selected a key that seemed as little used as the door itself. When he turned it in the lock, the click seemed to echo down the empty corridor. "I prefer not to enter," he said, taking a step back. "You have 15 minutes. Mrs. Cindy nodded and entered alone, closing the door behind her. Edward remained in the corridor, feeling his heart accelerate. 15 minutes that seemed like an eternity. When Mrs. Cindy finally came out, there was something different in her eyes, a deeper understanding, perhaps, or a certainty that Edward couldn't decipher. "I'm ready to meet the girls now," she said, as if nothing extraordinary had happened in that room. Edward led her to the twins' room, mentally preparing for the confrontation that would surely come. Opening the door, he found Olivia and Lauren still sitting on the carpet, but now with a chessboard between them. "Girls, this is Mrs. Cindy, your new nanny," he announced, trying to sound confident. The twins raised their eyes simultaneously, studying the newcomer with that evaluative look that Edward knew so well, the same look that had preceded disaster with the last 17 nannies. To Edward's surprise, Mrs. Cindy didn't try to smile artificially, nor did she bend down to be at the children's height, nor did she use that infantilized tone of voice that many adults adopt when speaking to children. She simply observed them with respect and attention. "Good. Morning, Olivia and Lauren," she said naturally. "I see you're playing chess." The girls exchanged a quick glance, clearly surprised at having been correctly identified right from the start, a feat that few people managed, given the similarity between them. "How do you know who's who?" asked Lauren, with genuine curiosity. Mrs. Cindy smiled slightly. "Each person has their own light," she answered simply, "even those who seem identical." Edward watched, fascinated, as an unusual silence settled in the room. For the first time in months, the twins seemed momentarily disconcerted, without a sharp response on the tip of their tongues. "I'll leave you to get to know each other better," said Edward, taking advantage of the moment of truce. "I'll be in the office if you need me." As he closed the door, he couldn't help but feel a pang of hope. It was too early to tell, but there was something about Mrs. Cindy that inspired a confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, she was different from the others. On his way to the office, Edward didn't notice the small detail that might explain Mrs. Cindy's strange familiarity with the house, the slight aroma of lavender that lingered in the air after she had visited Caroline's room, the same perfume his wife used, and that no one else had smelled in that house since her departure. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. It didn't take long for the twins to put their first test into practice. The morning after Mrs. Cindy's arrival, Olivia approached the new nanny with a glass of orange juice while she was organizing some clothes in the wardrobe. "I made this for you," said the girl, with an angelic smile that didn't reach her eyes, "to welcome you." Mrs. Cindy observed the glass for a moment, noticing the slight yellowish tone more intense than normal. Without hesitation, she took the glass and placed it on the dresser. "Thank you, Olivia. Very kind of you. I'll drink it shortly when I finish putting away these clothes." Olivia's smile faltered for an instant. From the other side of the room, Lauren observed the scene with attention, her eyes gleaming in anticipation. The two exchanged quick glances, a silent communication that dispensed with words. When Mrs. Cindy finally finished organizing the wardrobe, she picked up the glass and walked to the window. With a casual gesture, she poured the contents into the plant pot on the windowsill. "You know," she said, without turning to the girls, "vinegar is excellent for acidifying the soil of some plants. This azalea will thank you." Olivia's jaw dropped slightly. It was the first time a nanny hadn't fallen for the adulterated juice trap. On the bed, Lauren adjusted herself, suddenly more attentive. "It wasn't vinegar," Olivia tried to lie. "It was normal orange juice." "Of course," replied Mrs. Cindy, turning with a tranquil smile. "And I'm the Queen of Sheba." It was the first time in months that a sound resembling a laugh escaped Lauren's lips. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Olivia shot a disapproving look at her sister, who quickly regained her composure. During lunch, the twins remained silent, observing Mrs. Cindy's every move like predators studying prey. But, to their frustration, the new nanny seemed immune to the classic traps. She discreetly checked the salt before using it, avoided sitting in the chair that had one of its legs slightly sawed, a meticulous job by Lauren with the small saw from her father's tool set, and even completely ignored the strange noises that the girls started to make coming from the basement. "You know," Mrs. Cindy commented casually while washing the dishes, "when I was about your age, my cousin and I put pepper in our aunt's dinner. Her tongue burned for hours." The twins exchanged surprised looks. "And what happened to you?" asked Lauren, breaking her usual silence. "Oh, my aunt was clever," replied Mrs. Cindy, drying her hands on a dish towel. "The next day she prepared a delicious caramel pudding. My cousin and I devoured it all. Only afterward did we discover that she had put a potent laxative in the recipe." Olivia's eyes widened while Lauren tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "She couldn't do that," protested Olivia. "It's wrong to give medicine to children secretly." "Absolutely wrong," agreed Mrs. Cindy. "Just as it's wrong to put vinegar in someone's juice or saw the leg of a chair. Actions have consequences, don't they?" That afternoon, while Edward worked in his office oblivious to the small battles unfolding in the rest of the house, the twins implemented the second test. Taking advantage of a moment when Mrs. Cindy was in the bathroom, they quickly scattered some of their mother's old dolls in the most unexpected corners of the house, one in the toilet, another inside the stove, a third hanging by the neck from the living room chandelier. It was a strategy that had worked perfectly against the second-to-last nanny, a superstitious young woman who quit the job screaming after finding the fourth doll strangely positioned inside her wardrobe. When Mrs. Cindy returned and found the first doll, the one in the toilet, she simply removed it, carefully washed it, and placed it on the kitchen table. She did the same with each of the others she found, gathering them all in the same place. By the end of the afternoon, there were 7 old dolls lined up on the table. "Interesting collection," she commented when the girls finally appeared in the kitchen, curious about the lack of reaction. "These dolls seem special." "They were our mothers," said Lauren in a low voice. "I thought so," replied Mrs. Cindy. "Objects that belong to people we love carry a special energy." "Weren't you scared?" asked Olivia, unable to hide her frustration. "Scared? Of dolls?" Mrs. Cindy smiled slightly. "No, dear. I've seen much scarier things in life than toys out of place." There was something about the way she said it, a raw sincerity without any condescending tone, that made the girls look at each other momentarily without a response. "Would you like to help prepare dinner?" asked Mrs. Cindy, changing the subject. "I was thinking of making that chicken with okra that your father mentioned is your favorite." "How do you know how to make that?" questioned Olivia, suspicious. "Southern recipes are my specialty," replied Mrs. Cindy, unfazed. "I grew up in rural Virginia, you know, near Oak Ridge." Reluctant but intrigued, the twins ended up joining her in the kitchen. It was the first activity in which they participated without explicit resistance. Edward, arriving for dinner, could barely hide his surprise at finding his daughters helping to set the table under Mrs. Cindy's attentive supervision. "They're helping?" he asked Martha, who observed the scene with equal astonishment. "It's been like this all day, sir," replied the housekeeper in a low voice. "They did their usual mischief, but Mrs. Cindy didn't even blink. It's as if she knew exactly what to expect." During dinner, Edward noticed something that hadn't happened for months. An entire meal without incidents, without cutting comments from the girls, without that suffocating tension that had become the norm. The twins weren't exactly cheerful, but there was a curiosity in their gaze, especially when they observed Mrs. Cindy, that he hadn't seen since before Caroline's departure. Later, after putting the girls to bed, Mrs. Cindy found Edward in his office. He was hunched over a pile of documents, but his mind clearly wandered far from there. "They're asleep," she informed him, but before going to bed, they asked to leave the hallway light on. "They've been doing that since—" Edward stopped, unable to complete the sentence. "Thank you for today. It was the first day without crises in a long time." "They're intelligent girls," commented Mrs. Cindy, sitting in the chair opposite the desk. "They're testing limits, trying to understand the world around them after everything changed." "The psychologists said it's a form of grief, that they need time." Edward sighed, running his hand through his hair. "But it's been 2 years, and sometimes it seems like we're going backward, not forward." "Time is relative when it comes to pain," replied Mrs. Cindy, "especially for children." Edward observed her with attention, intrigued by the calm that this woman emanated. "How did you manage it?" he finally asked. "They sabotaged all the other nannies in the first few days." "Perhaps I'm not trying to replace anyone," she replied simply. "I'm just here." There was something in her words that touched Edward deeply, a simple truth that he himself had been avoiding. Since Caroline's departure, he had strived to fill all the voids, to compensate for all absences, to pretend that life could return to normal if he worked hard enough, if he found the right people, if he kept everything running perfectly. "Tomorrow, I'll need to reorganize some things in the house," said Mrs. Cindy, interrupting his thoughts. "I noticed that some furniture is blocking the circulation of energy." Edward raised his eyebrows, surprised by the change of subject. "Do you believe in those things? House energy?" "I believe that spaces speak," she replied. "And this house is screaming, Mr. Mitchell." Before Edward could question what she meant by that, Mrs. Cindy stood up and wished him good night. He remained in the office for a few more hours, reflecting on the unusual day and on the strange sensation that something had changed in the air of that house. The next morning, Edward woke to the sound of furniture being dragged. Going down to the living room, he found Mrs. Cindy supervising a complete reorganization of the environment. The sofa that previously had its back to the window was now positioned facing it. The old sideboard had been moved to the other side of the room, and the plants redistributed to strategic points. "Good morning," she greeted him, as if reorganizing an entire house at 7 in the morning were the most natural thing in the world. "I hope I didn't wake you." "What's happening here?" asked Edward, still sleepy. "As I said, reorganization. The room was blocked. Now the light enters properly and the energy can circulate. Edward was about to question that logic when he noticed something even more surprising. Olivia and Lauren were helping. Each one carried small objects, following Mrs. Cindy's instructions without protest. "They woke up early to help?" he asked, incredulous. "Actually, they woke me up," replied Mrs. Cindy with a slight smile. "They said they wanted to see what I was going to do today." The girls, upon noticing their father's presence, quickly resumed their neutral expressions, but did not abandon the task. It was as if Mrs. Cindy had established a magnetic field around her, an irresistible curiosity that even the twins couldn't ignore. Later that day, while the girls were busy with online classes, Edward found Mrs. Cindy in the second-floor corridor. She was standing in front of Caroline's room with a contemplative expression. "You seem fascinated by that room," he commented, approaching hesitantly. "Not by the room," replied Mrs. Cindy, without taking her eyes off the closed door, "by the story it holds." "A story that ended," said Edward with more bitterness than he intended. Mrs. Cindy turned to him, her dark eyes penetrating as if they could see beyond words. "Stories never really end, Mr. Mitchell. They just change chapters." There was something in the way she said it, a quiet certainty, a wisdom that seemed to come from a deep place, that made Edward wonder, not for the first time, who this woman really was, who had agreed to take care of his daughters when all others had given up. Later, as he passed by the girls' room, Edward stopped upon hearing Mrs. Cindy's voice. She was telling a story, something about a girl who found an injured bird and healed it, only to see it fly away. The moral wasn't about possession or loss, but about how some loves are measured by the freedom we grant, not by how long they last. The twins listened in silence, their small silhouettes outlined against the golden light of dusk coming through the window. It was the first time in 2 years that Edward had seen them so quiet, so attentive, without that restless and destructive energy that had become their trademark. It was at that moment, discreetly observing from the door, that Edward felt a pang of genuine hope. Maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Cindy was the person they so desperately needed, not to fill the void left by Caroline, but to help them find a path through it. What Edward didn't notice, however, was the small gesture that Mrs. Cindy made while telling the story, the way her hand briefly caressed the armchair next to the bed, exactly the same way Caroline used to do while reading to her daughters before bedtime. A gesture so specific, so personal, that no one could know unless they had witnessed it many times. In the 3rd week after Mrs. Cindy's arrival, routine at the Mitchell mansion had found a new rhythm. The twins' sabotage hadn't completely ceased, but diminished in frequency and intensity. It was as if the game had lost some of its appeal in the face of an opponent who always seemed to be 3 steps ahead, predicting each move even before it was executed. That Saturday morning, while Edward participated in a video conference in his office, Mrs. Cindy proposed a different activity to the girls, cleaning the old toy chest that remained forgotten in the corner of their room. "Why do we need to clean that?" questioned Olivia, looking with suspicion at the dark wooden chest. "Nobody has touched it in centuries." "Exactly because of that," replied Mrs. Cindy, already opening the windows to let in more light. "Objects stored for too long accumulate dust and stagnant energy." "You talk a lot about energy," observed Lauren, who in recent weeks had begun to communicate more, although still maintaining a calculated distance. "Are you some kind of witch?" Mrs. Cindy smiled upon hearing the direct question. "Witches are wise women who understand the cycles of life and nature," she replied calmly. "If that makes me a witch, then perhaps I am." The twins exchanged surprised looks. They hadn't expected such a direct and honest answer. Most adults would have ignored the question or treated it as childish nonsense. "My grandmother said witches fly on broomsticks," commented Olivia, as she reluctantly approached the chest. "And did your grandmother ever see a witch flying?" asked Mrs. Cindy, raising an eyebrow. "I don't think so," replied the girl after thinking for a moment. "Exactly. The stories we tell about things don't always reflect their truth." There was something in the way Mrs. Cindy spoke, without condescension, without unnecessary filters, that provoked in the girls a curiosity that temporarily outweighed their resistance. With a resigned sigh, Olivia finally knelt beside the chest, followed by Lauren. When they opened the lid, a cloud of dust rose into the air, making all three cough. The interior of the chest revealed layers of toys and objects, some clearly from when the girls were younger, others that seemed to have belonged to previous generations. "Look at this," said Mrs. Cindy, removing a small wooden horse. "What a beautiful piece, Southern craftsmanship for sure." "It was Grandpa's," explained Lauren, suddenly animated. "He gave it to us when we turned 5. The girls began to remove the objects one by one, each piece triggering a small memory, a story that hadn't been revisited since Caroline's departure. Mrs. Cindy listened attentively to each comment, each shared memory, without pressing for more information, when the girls abruptly fell silent upon touching some more sensitive recollection. It was Olivia who found the diary, hidden beneath a pile of children's books at the bottom of the chest. It was a hardcover notebook, decorated with hand-painted flowers, with a small padlock that had long lost its key. "What's this?" she asked, turning the object in her hands. Lauren approached, her eyes wide in recognition. "It's Mom's diary," she whispered, as if revealing that information aloud might make the object disappear. "The one she wrote in when we were little." Mrs. Cindy observed the girls' reaction carefully, noting how their bodies instantly tensed. It was the first time she had heard them mention Caroline so directly. "A diary is a treasure," she commented softly. "It's where we keep pieces of ourselves for the future." Olivia looked at the notebook with a mixture of fascination and fear, like someone contemplating an object with unknown powers. "We can't open it," she finally said. "It's private." "It was," corrected Lauren, with surprising firmness. "Now it's a memento." The two stared at each other for a long moment, a silent communication that Mrs. Cindy didn't try to interrupt. Finally, with slightly trembling hands, Olivia opened the broken padlock. The first pages were filled with elegant and fluid handwriting. They weren't just words. There were drawings, clippings, small dried flowers pressed between the pages. It was a living record, colorful, full of personality. "Today the girls said their first words," read Olivia aloud, her voice choked. Olivia said, "Dada," and Lauren said, "Mama." "Edward thinks they're already competing to see who wins over which parent." A small smile appeared on Lauren's face. "I was always Mum's favorite," she said, in a tone that mixed pride and deep sadness. "And I was Dad's," added Olivia, without the usual challenging tone. Mrs. Cindy remained silent, just observing as the twins slowly leafed through the diary, discovering small fragments of their mother's life and their own childhood, preserved in those pages. "The girls turned 5 today," read Lauren a few pages further. "We had a picnic in the garden with that chocolate and strawberry cake they love so much." Olivia insisted on wearing the blue dress even though it was too small. "She's as stubborn as her father." "I'm not stubborn," Olivia automatically protested, then smiled as she realized the irony. The two continued reading for almost an hour, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, sharing looks and small smiles, as they rediscovered memories that had been carefully buried over the past 2 years. Mrs. Cindy just remained there, a discreet but constant presence, offering a tissue when one of their eyes welled up, or a gentle comment when the silence became too heavy. "She wrote about us as if we were special," commented Lauren finally, closing the diary. "You were," replied Mrs. Cindy, "and you still are." "But she left," said Olivia, the old bitterness returning to her voice. "Not by choice," corrected Mrs. Cindy gently, "and not everything we love needs to be physically present to continue existing in our lives." There was something in those words, a simple truth without subterfuge, that seemed to touch the girls deeply. There was no dramatic crying, no emotional confessions, just a long, contemplative silence, as if a small floodgate had been opened, allowing a trickle of water to begin flowing again. "Can we keep the diary?" asked Lauren after a few minutes. "Of course you can," replied Mrs. Cindy. "It belongs to you now." That night, Edward noticed a subtle change in his daughter's behavior during dinner. It wasn't anything explicit, They still maintained a certain reserve, still avoided his gaze for too long, but there was a different lightness in the air, as if an invisible weight had been slightly lifted. "Productive day?" he asked Mrs. Cindy when the girls had already gone upstairs to prepare for bed. "We cleaned the old toy chest," she replied, while helping to collect the plates. "The girls found some mementos." "What kind of mementos?" The question came out more anxious than Edward intended. "The kind that helps to remember, not just to forget," replied Mrs. Cindy, with that enigmatic way that Edward still hadn't gotten used to. Later, as he passed by his daughter's room to say goodnight, Edward noticed something unusual. The door was ajar, and the two were sitting on Lauren's bed, bent over an old notebook that he immediately recognized. Caroline's diary. His first impulse was to enter and ask where that object had come from, which he thought was lost or stored in some inaccessible corner of the house. But something stopped him. Perhaps the serene expression on his daughter's faces, or the intimacy of that moment shared between them, something he hadn't witnessed in a long time. Instead, he silently moved away, with a mixture of emotions that he couldn't completely name. There was sadness, yes, but also a strange comfort in knowing that Caroline, somehow, was present again in her daughter's lives, even if through words written in a time that seemed to belong to another life. The next morning, Edward found Mrs. Cindy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast even before Martha arrived. "Good morning," she greeted him while beating a pancake batter. "The girls asked for pancakes with chocolate syrup. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," replied Edward, serving himself coffee. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I saw the girls with Caroline's diary last night," Mrs. Cindy continued, to beat the batter, showing no surprise. "We found it in the toy chest," she explained. "They wanted to keep it." "And you thought that was a good idea?" The question wasn't an accusation, but a genuine doubt. "I believe so," replied Mrs. Cindy, finally looking at him. "Sometimes we need to look back in order to move forward." Edward nodded slowly, absorbing those words. "Did they talk about her? About Caroline?" "A little," said Mrs. Cindy. "More important than talking is allowing oneself to feel, and yesterday they allowed themselves to, perhaps for the first time since it happened." Edward felt a lump in his throat. He himself had avoided talking about Caroline, convinced that keeping the past at a distance was the only way to survive the present. But observing the gradual transformation of his daughters in recent weeks, he began to question if that strategy had been the wisest. "You know," continued Mrs. Cindy as she began to cook the pancakes, "grief isn't about forgetting, it's about learning to carry the absence in a way that doesn't crush us." There was a wisdom in those words that touched Edward deeply, as if Mrs. Cindy were verbalizing something he had always known, but never managed to formulate. "How do you know so much about this?" he finally asked. Mrs. Cindy flipped a pancake in the air with perfection before responding. "Life teaches, Mr. Mitchell. Life teaches." That morning, for the first time in 2 years, the twins came down for breakfast without being called. Their faces still carried that premature seriousness that had become their trademark, but there was something different in their eyes, a small flame, undeniably lit. "Good morning, Dad," they said almost in unison, sitting at the table. "Good." "Morning, girls," replied Edward, trying to hide his surprise. "Did you sleep well?" "More or less," replied Olivia while serving herself juice. "We stayed up late reading." "Mom's diary," added Lauren, looking directly at her father, as if challenging him to comment. Edward swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed under his daughter's gaze. "And what did you think?" he asked cautiously. "She wrote funny," said Olivia with a small smile, "and she drew us making messes." "There's even that time we painted Buddy blue," added Lauren, referring to the family's old dog who had passed away the same year as Caroline. She was angry but wrote that she laughed in secret. Edward felt his eyes burn with contained tears. It was the first time in 2 years that he had heard his daughters talk about their mother in such a natural way, without the burden of anger and pain that had characterized any mention of the past. "She always had difficulty staying angry with you," he commented, his voice slightly choked. "She said you had inherited her mischievous side." The girls looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and curiosity, as if they were seeing a facet of their father they had forgotten existed. "Did you know our mother, Mrs. Cindy?" Lauren suddenly asked. The question hung in the air, like a soap bubble, fragile and iridescent. Edward turned to the nanny, equally interested in the answer. Mrs. Cindy remained silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. "I've known many mothers in my life," she finally replied, "and through the diary I'm getting to know yours. She seemed to be someone very special." It wasn't exactly an answer to the question asked, Edward realized. But before he could reflect more on this, Lauren continued. "In the diary she talks about a cornbread recipe that Grandma used to make. Do you know how to make cornbread, Mrs. Cindy?" "It's one of my specialties," replied the nanny with a smile. "We could make some today if you'd like." "With cheese inside, like Grandma's?" insisted Olivia, suddenly animated. "Exactly like Grandma's," assured Mrs. Cindy. As he observed the interaction, Edward couldn't help but notice how Mrs. Cindy seemed to know exactly what to say, what to offer, as if she had a detailed map of the family's emotional territory, a map that he himself had lost long. Phagositult later that day, passing by the kitchen and smelling the unmistakable aroma of cornbread in the air, Edward stopped at the door, observing the scene unfolding. Olivia and Lauren, with improvised aprons, faces stained with flour, helping Mrs. Cindy prepare the recipe that had been a family tradition for generations. There was something about that image, in the simplicity of that shared moment, that compressed his heart in a way that was simultaneously painful and comforting. As if, after so long navigating turbulent waters, he finally glimpsed the possibility of a safe harbor on the horizon. The month of June arrived with a sequence of rainy days that transformed Boston into a watercolor of grays and greens intensified by humidity. At the Mitchell mansion, the arrival of the cold brought with it the need to reorganize the girls' wardrobe for the new season. It was during this task that Edward, looking for empty boxes in the attic to store the summer clothes, made an unexpected discovery. The house's attic was one of those rarely visited spaces, full of boxed and forgotten memories. Edward hadn't gone up there for at least a year, since the last time he needed to retrieve some Christmas decorations, an occasion in which he had sent Martha in his place, unable to face the inevitable fragments of the past he would find. This time, however, he had decided to go personally. Something had changed in recent weeks, a small but persistent courage which began to manifest in gestures like this. As he opened the heavy door that led to the attic stairs, the characteristic smell of old wood and dust greeted him like an old acquaintance. The boxes he was looking for were stacked in a corner, exactly where he remembered leaving them. But it was while pulling one of them that Edward accidentally knocked over a small shoebox that was balanced on top of a nearby shelf. The contents spilled onto the dusty floor, envelopes, postcards, and some old photographs. Edward knelt to collect the items when his gaze caught the familiar handwriting on one of the envelopes. It was Caroline's handwriting, those elegant curves slightly inclined to the right that he would recognize anywhere. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. It was open, as if it had already been read and put away again. The paper was of good quality, the kind that Caroline liked to use for special correspondence. The recipient, written on the front of the envelope in the same neat handwriting, simply said, "For Cindy." Edward's heart instantly accelerated. Cindy, a nickname for Cynthia, Mrs. Cindy, could it be possible? Carefully, he removed the letter from the envelope. It was dated just 3 weeks before the accident that took Caroline. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. "Dear Cindy," the letter began, "it's been so long since our days in Oak Ridge that sometimes I wonder if that life really existed. The cobblestone streets, our conversations on the church steps, the plans we made while the world seemed so big and promising before us." Edward sat on the dusty floor, absorbed in his wife's words. The letter continued, revealing a friendship he had never heard about. Caroline and Cindy had been friends in their youth, students at the same school in Oak Ridge. Their paths separated when Caroline went to Boston to study architecture, while her friend remained in the countryside. As he read, Edward felt as If he were discovering a side of Caroline he had never completely known, her insecurities about motherhood, her fears about the future, her constant concern for her daughters. "Sometimes I have a strange feeling, Cindy," said a passage that made Edward pause, feeling a chill run down his spine. "As if I won't be here to see my girls grow up. It's silly, probably just fatigue. But if something happens, I trust you to fulfill what you promised that summer night, remember? Take care of them as only you would know how. Edward is a good man, a wonderful father, but he doesn't understand the silent language of the girls as you would." The letter fell from Edward's trembling hands. A whirlwind of emotions invaded him. Confusion, disbelief, a pang of betrayal that Caroline had never mentioned this friendship, and above all, a growing suspicion about who the woman really was, who had been taking care of his daughters for 2 months. He quickly collected the other letters and put them back in the box, descending the attic stairs with hurried steps. He needed to confront Mrs. Cindy, to understand what kind of connection she had with his family and why she had kept it a secret. He found her in the library, helping the twins with their homework. The scene was one of such domesticity that, for a moment, Edward hesitated, questioning whether he should interrupt that rare moment of tranquility. "Girls, could you give me a moment alone with Mrs. Cindy, please?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Olivia and Lauren looked up from their notebooks, immediately attentive to the poorly disguised tension in their father's voice. "But we haven't finished the geography lesson," protested Olivia. "You can continue later," insisted Edward. "It's important." The girls exchanged quick glances, that silent communication they always shared in moments of uncertainty. Reluctantly, they collected their materials and left the library, but not before casting curious glances at their father and the nanny. When the door closed, Edward walked to the central table of the library and placed the letter on it, facing Mrs. Cindy. "I found this in the attic," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on her. "I believe you have some explaining to do." Mrs. Cindy looked at the letter for a long moment without showing surprise. When she finally raised her eyes to meet Edward's, there was a serenity in her gaze that disconcerted him. "I was wondering when you would find it," she said simply. "So you're not going to deny it?" Edward's voice betrayed his indignation. "You knew my wife. You had a connection with her that I was completely unaware of, and you entered our house without revealing any of this." "I didn't deny it when asked," replied Mrs. Cindy with the same calm. "I simply didn't offer information that wasn't requested." "That's manipulation!" exclaimed Edward, lightly hitting the table. "You entered our lives under false pretenses." "I entered your daughters' lives to fulfill a promise," corrected Mrs. Cindy, her voice gaining a firmness that Edward had not yet witnessed. "A promise made many years ago, when Caroline and I were still young. We swore to each other that, if anything happened to either of us, the other would take care of our children." Edward sat in the chair across from her, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Why did she never tell me about you?" "Caroline and I lost touch for many years," explained Mrs. Cindy. "Our paths separated. She went to university, got married, built a life here. I remained in Oak Ridge, taking care of my sick mother. We reunited only 2 years before the accident by chance at an art exhibition in Oak Ridge County Museum. The mention of Caroline's favorite place, the open-air museum where she used to take the girls on Sundays, brought a new wave of emotion to Edward. She never mentioned this reunion, he said, more to himself than to Mrs. Cindy. Caroline was always reserved about certain parts of her life, replied Mrs. Cindy with an understanding look. I believe she kept some friendships as personal treasures, things that belonged only to her. Edward reflected on those words, recognizing the truth in them. Caroline had always kept certain aspects of her life in separate compartments, her childhood memories, some old friends, her passion for poetry that she cultivated in notebooks she rarely showed to anyone. In the letter, she mentions a promise, made on a summer night, said Edward, pointing to the paper on the table. What promise was that? Mrs. Cindy smiled slightly, as if the memory brought comfort. We were 16, she began. It was a summer festival in Oak Ridge. We lit a candle together and made a solemn oath, as teenagers like to do. We promised that, If one of us departed, too soon the other would take care of her children. At the time it was just a silly ritual of dreamy girls. And years later, when you reunited, we recalled that promise, now with the wisdom of adulthood. Caroline commented that if something happened to her, she wouldn't trust anyone else to truly understand her daughters. Mrs. Cindy paused, carefully choosing her next words. She loved you deeply, Mr. Mitchell, but she feared that alone you wouldn't be able to comprehend the girl's inner world. Those words hit Edward like a physical blow. It was a truth that he himself had been facing for the past 2 years, his inability to penetrate the emotional fortress that Olivia and Lauren had built around themselves after the loss of their mother. "Why did you wait so long?" he finally asked. "If you made this promise, why didn't you come right after Caroline left?" Mrs. Cindy sighed, and for the first time, Edward saw a flash of vulnerability in her eyes. "I came to the funeral," she revealed. "I stayed at the back of the chapel, observing from a distance. I saw you devastated, carrying not just your own pain, but trying to be strong for the girls. It didn't seem the right time for a stranger to appear with a story about old promises. And, afterward, I kept track from afar. I knew you had hired professional help for the girls, that you were doing everything possible to rebuild a life. I thought perhaps I wasn't needed." Mrs. Cindy paused, "until I started hearing about the nannies who came and went, about how the girls were closing themselves off more and more. That's when I knew it was time to fulfill my promise." Edward looked out the library window, observing the fine rain falling on the garden. The initial anger had given way to a melancholic confusion, a feeling that the universe around him was much more complex and interconnected than he had ever imagined. "What did the letter that Caroline sent you say?" he asked, turning back to Mrs. Cindy. "She must have replied to this one I found." "There was no reply," said Mrs. Cindy, with a note of sadness in her voice. "This letter arrived at my house 2 days after the accident. Caroline never knew if I received it." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with lost possibilities and paths never taken. Edward felt a tear escape, which he quickly wiped with the back of his hand. "You can fire me if you wish," Mrs. Cindy finally said. "I'll understand if you feel I betrayed your trust." Edward observed her for a long time, seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just a competent nanny who had achieved the impossible by connecting with his daughters. She was a living link to Caroline, a fulfilled promise, a bridge between the past and future that he didn't know he needed until that moment. "The girls adore you," he said simply. "For the first time in 2 years, I see glimpses of the daughters I knew before everything changed. It would be selfish of me to deprive them of that because of wounded pride." Mrs. Cindy nodded, a silent gratitude in her gaze. "I have. Just one request," continued Edward. "I'd like you to tell me about your friendship with Caroline. About the Caroline I didn't know, the young woman from Oakridge, the friend who made promises on summer nights." A genuine smile illuminated Mrs. Cindy's face. "It would be an honor," she replied. That night, after the girls went to bed, Edward and Mrs. Cindy remained on the porch, protected from the persistent drizzle, sharing stories of a Caroline who existed before their paths crossed. Edward discovered a young idealist who dreamed of designing schools in underprivileged communities, who wrote poems in the margins of notebooks, who knew by heart all the winding streets of Oakridge. Each story was like a small treasure, a piece of a puzzle that Edward thought he had already completed, only to discover that the image was much larger than he imagined. "She was afraid of not being a good mother, you know," revealed Mrs. Cindy, after telling a particularly amusing story about a teenage mischief. "When we reunited, the twins had just turned 6. Caroline confessed that she feared not being able to guide them adequately into adolescence, that she felt unprepared for the challenges that would come." "She never told me that," commented Edward, surprised. "Caroline kept her insecurities for few," replied Mrs. Cindy. "She said you put her on such a high pedestal that she was afraid to disappoint if she showed her doubts." Those words hit Edward deeply. It was true. He had always seen Caroline as a force of nature, unshakable, perfectly adapted to motherhood and all the roles she assumed. The idea that she also carried doubts and fears was simultaneously painful and comforting. It made her more human, closer, even in absence. She was especially worried about Lauren, continued Mrs. Cindy. She said Olivia was like an open book, easy to read, but that Lauren kept everything inside like a tightly closed little box of secrets. Edward nodded, recognizing the precision of that observation. Caroline knew them so well, he murmured. And she still does, replied Mrs. Cindy with a quiet conviction. Through the love she left in them, the memories they kept, the personality traits they inherited, a mother never completely leaves her children, Mr. Mitchell. There was a wisdom in those words that touched Edward deeply. For 2 years, he had tried to protect his daughters from the pain of loss, avoiding mentions of Caroline, keeping her things locked away, as if the absence could be less painful if it were complete. But Mrs. Cindy, in a few weeks, had shown a different path, not one of forgetting, but of integration, of accepting the loss as part of the story, not as its end. "You should tell them," said Mrs. Cindy softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Tell them what?" "About me, about the letter, about the friendship that brought me here." Edward hesitated. Part of him feared his daughter's reaction upon discovering that Mrs. Cindy had kept this connection a secret. Another part, however, recognized the importance of that truth. "Do you think they'll understand?" "I think they need to understand," replied Mrs. Cindy. "They need to know that I'm not here by chance, that there's an invisible thread that connects me to you through Caroline. This might help them accept my presence not as a substitute, but as a continuation." Edward nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in that advice. "Tomorrow," he decided. "We'll tell them tomorrow together." As the rain continued to fall softly outside, Edward felt a strange peace settle in his chest, as if, after a long time wandering in a dark labyrinth, he finally glimpsed a path to the light. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The next morning dawned with a clear sky, as if the previous night's rain had washed away not only the city, but also the uncertainties that hovered over the Mitchell mansion. Edward woke up early, with renewed determination. The conversation with Mrs. Cindy had brought to the surface memories and feelings he had carefully kept stored, but contrary to what he had feared, reliving those memories hadn't intensified the pain. It had somehow made it more bearable. He went down to the kitchen still wearing his robe, something he rarely did. He found Mrs. Cindy already up, preparing a batch of cheese biscuits, the comforting aroma filling the entire environment. "Good morning," she greeted him, showing no surprise at seeing him out of his usual routine. "Sleep well?" "Better than expected," replied Edward, serving himself coffee. "I've been thinking about our conversation. And I want to tell the girls today, as we agreed, but I also want to open Caroline's room." Mrs. Cindy stopped what she was doing, observing him carefully. "Are you sure about that?" "No," admitted Edward, with a slight smile, "but I feel it's the right time. That room has become an untouched sanctuary, as if Caroline were just traveling, and could return at any moment. It's not healthy for any of us." "I agree," said Mrs. Cindy, resuming her work with the dough. "But it's an important decision. How do you plan to do it?" "I thought about starting with the letter, telling the girls about your friendship. Then perhaps we could go to the room together, me, you, and them, not to empty or change everything at once, but to start transforming it from a space frozen in time to a place of living memories." Mrs. Cindy nodded, a gleam of approval in her eyes. "It's a good plan," she said. "The girls are more prepared than you imagine." The diary opened, a door that had been closed for a long time. Edward finished his coffee in silence, contemplating the day ahead. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel that crushing weight when thinking about Caroline, about her absence, about everything that had been lost. Instead, there was a soft melancholy, but also a curious sensation of possibility, as if a new chapter were about to begin. The twins came down for breakfast shortly after, still in pajamas, their hair tousled from the night's sleep. Edward observed them with new eyes, noticing small details he had let slip in recent months. How Olivia slightly wrinkled her nose when laughing, exactly as Caroline did. How Lauren had the same thoughtful gesture as her mother, lightly touching her chin when she was concentrating. "Good morning, girls," he said, feeling a wave of love so intense it almost left him breathless. "Good morning, Dad," they replied in their habitual synchrony. "After breakfast, I'd like to talk to you," continued Edward. "There's something important I need to tell you." The girls exchanged quick glances, that silent communication they always shared. "Are we in trouble?" asked Olivia, with a slight tone of concern. "Not at all," assured Edward, smiling. "It's just something you should know." Breakfast proceeded in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by comments about Mrs. Cindy's perfect cheese biscuits and plans for the weekend. When they finished, Edward led his daughters to the living room, where he had placed the box of letters found in the attic. Mrs. Cindy followed them, keeping herself discreetly in the background, a comforting presence, but not intrusive. "Yesterday, I found something in the attic," began Edward, sitting on the sofa and inviting the girls to sit beside him. "Letters from Mom." The twins' eyes widened simultaneously, fixing on the shoebox on the coffee table. "Letters to whom?" asked Lauren, her voice barely above a whisper. "To a friend," replied Edward, carefully removing the letter he had shown to Mrs. Cindy. A very special friend from the time she lived in Oakridge before we met." "Who?" insisted Olivia, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Edward looked at Mrs. Cindy, who took a step forward, approaching the sofa. "To me," she said with simplicity. The silence that followed was almost palpable. The twins looked from the nanny to their father, and back to the nanny, their expressions oscillating between confusion, surprise, and a growing understanding. "You knew our mother?" asked Lauren finally, her voice betraying an emotion she rarely let show. "We were childhood friends," confirmed Mrs. Cindy, sitting in the armchair nearby. "We grew up together in Oakridge, studied at the same school, shared dreams and secrets as young people do." "Why did you never tell us?" Olivia's question had an accusatory tone, but her eyes shone with an intense curiosity. "Because I needed to get to know you for who you are first," replied Mrs. Cindy gently. "I didn't want you to see me as a connection to the past before accepting me in the present." Edward observed the interaction with his heart racing, surprised by Mrs. Cindy's direct honesty and by the way the girls seemed to absorb every word. "This letter," he continued, showing the paper in his hands, "was written by Mom a few weeks before the accident. In it, she talks about her friendship with Mrs. Cindy and about a promise they made when they were young." "What promise?" asked Lauren, leaning forward. Edward hesitated, searching for the right words. "A promise of care," replied Mrs. Cindy. "Saving him. We promised each other that if anything happened to either of us, the other would take care of her children. It was the kind of solemn oath that young people make, without imagining that one day it would be necessary to fulfill it." "So you came because of that promise?" questioned Olivia, her tone a mixture of distrust and fascination. "I came because of the promise," confirmed Mrs. Cindy, "but I stayed because of you." There was such pure sincerity in that response that even Olivia, always the most skeptical of the two, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Can I read the letter?" asked Lauren, extending her hesitant hand. Edward gave the paper to her, observing as the two moved closer to read together. Their faces subtly changed as they absorbed Caroline's words. Surprise, contained emotion, small smiles at references to shared memories that only Mrs. Cindy could completely understand. "She says here that you would understand our silent language," commented Lauren, raising her eyes from the paper. "What does that mean?" "Your mother believed that each person has a unique way of expressing what they feel," explained Mrs. Cindy. "Not always with words, sometimes with gestures, with silences, with small actions that seem insignificant to those who don't know how to interpret them." "Like when you knew it was us putting the dolls around the house?" asked Olivia, surprising both Edward and Mrs. Cindy with her frankness. "Exactly," smiled Mrs. Cindy. "It wasn't hard to see that you weren't trying to scare, but to test, to see how much I would endure before giving up, like the other nannies." "And you didn't give up," stated Lauren, almost to herself. "I wouldn't," confirmed Mrs. Cindy, A promise is a promise. Edward observed, amazed, as a silent understanding seemed to establish itself between the nanny and his daughters, a comprehension that went beyond the words exchanged, as if a puzzle finally found its missing pieces. "There's one more thing. I'd like to propose to you today," said Edward, when the silence extended. "Something I've been putting off for a long time, but that now seems the right moment to do." The girls looked at him expectantly. "I'd like to open Mom's room," he continued, feeling his heart accelerate. "Not to change everything or remove her things, but to transform it into a space where we can remember her with joy, not just with sadness." The impact of those words was visible on the twins' faces. It was a subject that had become almost taboo in the house. The closed room at the end of the corridor preserved exactly as it was on Caroline's last day. "Can we help?" asked Lauren, surprising Edward with her readiness. Yes, of course," he replied, moved. "I'd very much like your help." "We could put her diary there," suggested Olivia, her voice gaining animation. "And the photos we found in the chest." Edward felt tears forming in his eyes, but they were different from the tears he had shed in the last 2 years. They weren't just of loss, but also of a strange gratitude, of a recognition that something important was happening there, in that room, between him and his daughters. "Could we go now?" asked Lauren, an almost childish impatience in her voice, a tone that Edward hadn't heard for so long that his heart almost skipped a beat upon recognizing it. "Right now," he agreed, standing up. The four climbed the stairs in silence, a small, solemn procession toward the closed room. Edward felt the weight of the key in his pocket, that small metal object that had become a symbol of everything he had tried to keep away, preserved, untouched. When they reached the door, he briefly hesitated before inserting the key in the lock. He looked at his daughters, seeking confirmation. "Are you sure?" he asked, more to himself than to them. Olivia and Lauren nodded simultaneously, their faces expressing a determination he hadn't seen in a long time. The door opened with a slight creak, revealing the room that had remained practically untouched for 2 years. The morning light entered through the cracks in the closed curtains, creating golden beams that danced on the accumulated dust. Caroline's perfume, a mixture of lavender and a citrus touch, still lingered slightly in the air like a gentle ghost. The girls entered first, their steps hesitant on the carpet. Edward and Mrs. Cindy remained at the threshold, observing as they rediscovered the space, the dressing table with the perfume bottles aligned, the silver hairbrush that had belonged to Caroline's grandmother, the book still open on the bedside. Table, marking the last page, read. "It's exactly the same," commented Lauren, running her fingers over the crocheted quilt on the bed. "As if she were going to return at any moment," completed Olivia, her voice choked. Edward felt a lump in his throat. It was exactly how he had kept the room, as a sanctuary frozen in time, preserving the illusion that the absence was temporary, not permanent. "She loved this room so much," he said, finally entering. "She chose every detail with such care." "Remember, she used to spend hours here reading," commented Lauren, opening the curtains to let the light fully enter. "Sometimes we would come and lie on the bed with her, one on each side. And she would do different voices for each character," added Olivia, a small smile appearing on her lips. Edward observed, amazed, as the memories began to flow, not with the searing pain he had feared, but with a melancholic sweetness that somehow seemed to heal rather than hurt. Mrs. Cindy remained discreetly at the door, a silent but essential presence. Her gaze met Edward's, and in it was a deep understanding, as if she knew exactly what that moment meant, not just for the girls, but for him too. "We can change some things," suggested Olivia, surprising Edward with her initiative. "Not everything, but to make it more like a place to remember, not just to keep." "What would you like to change?" asked Edward, moved by the wisdom of that proposal. The twins looked at each other, that silent communication they always shared. "We could open the windows more," suggested Lauren. "Mom loved natural light." "And bring some of her plants from the sunroom," added Olivia, "the ferns she loved so much." "And put our photos," continued Lauren, getting animated. "Not just the old ones, but new ones too, to show that we're still living, you know." Edward felt the tears finally overflow, unable to contain the emotion in the face of the profound wisdom his daughters displayed, an understanding that went beyond their age, a maturity born of pain, but also of love. "I think she would love." "That," he said, his voice choked. "I'm sure she would," agreed Mrs. Cindy, finally entering the room. Caroline always preferred life to preservation, movement to stagnation. There was something in the way she said it, with such certainty, with such intimate knowledge, that made Edward realize, not for the first time, how providential that woman's presence had been in their lives. The following hours were dedicated, and it was subtle but profound transformation, not a removal of what had been, but an integration of the past with the present. The curtains were completely opened, allowing light to flood every corner. Some plants were brought from the sunroom and strategically positioned near the windows. The drawers were carefully organized, some clothes separated for donation, others kept as precious mementos. In each small decision, each choice about what to keep and what to change, Edward saw his daughters processing grief in a way they had never managed before, not avoiding the pain but transforming it into something new, something they could carry without being crushed by its weight. Mrs. Cindy participated discreetly, offering suggestions only when requested, but Edward noticed how the girls frequently sought her approval with their gaze, as if they recognized in her a special connection to the mother they had lost. When the sun began to set, casting a golden light through the now unimpeded windows, the four sat on the edge of the bed, contemplating the transformation. The room was still undeniably Caroline's, her essence remained in every detail, but now it breathed, lived, was no longer frozen in time like a museum of loss. "What do you think?" asked Edward, looking at his daughters. "It feels right," replied Lauren after a moment of reflection, as if she could walk in at any moment and approve. "I think she would approve," said Olivia, surprising everyone with the certainty in her voice. "Mom didn't like things standing still in time. Remember how she was always moving the furniture around?" Edward laughed softly, the memory bringing more joy than pain. Yes, she loved rearranging everything. She said the energy needed to circulate. "Just like Mrs. Cindy," observed Lauren, looking at the nanny with a new understanding. "We learned together," replied Mrs. Cindy with a soft smile. In her grandmother's house in Oakridge, Mrs. Teresa was an expert in energies and spaces. "Grandma Teresa!" exclaimed Olivia, her eyes shining. "Mom talked about her so much. She said she knew magical recipes." "And she really did," confirmed Mrs. Cindy. "Her cornbread with cheese was the best in Virginia, and she taught me to make it exactly as it should be. That's why it was just like Grandma's," concluded Lauren, with a flash of understanding. That simple connection, the cornbread that linked generations, traditions, memories, seemed to perfectly symbolize what was happening in that room. The creation of a bridge between the past and the present, allowing life to continue flowing. "I think that's enough for today," said Edward, noticing the first signs of fatigue in his daughters. "We'll continue tomorrow if you want." The girls nodded, reluctant to leave the room but recognizing the wisdom of not doing everything at once. Before leaving, however, Lauren stopped in front of Caroline's dressing table, where a small wooden jewelry box remained closed. Carefully, she opened it and removed a delicate silver necklace with a bird-shaped pendant. "I remember this necklace," she said, holding it against the light. "Mom said it was special." Mrs. Cindy approached, a look of recognition in her eyes. "It was a 15th birthday present," she said. "We bought them together at a craft fair in Oakridge. She chose the bird, I chose a butterfly." "Do you still have yours?" asked Olivia, curious. Mrs. Cindy smiled, removing a small folded handkerchief from her pocket. Upon opening it, she revealed a pendant identical to Caroline's, but in the shape of a butterfly. "I never parted with it," she said simply. Edward observed, as the girls looked in wonder at that tangible proof of the friendship between their mother and the woman who now cared for them. It was as if a circle were closing, a promise made decades ago finally fulfilling its purpose. As they left the room, Edward noticed that for the first time in 2 years, he didn't lock the door. He left it just ajar, allowing the air to circulate, allowing life to flow again between those walls. And as he descended the stairs with his daughters ahead and Mrs. Cindy at his side, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sensation that, despite everything they had lost, there was still a future ahead, different from what they had imagined, but a future nonetheless. 6 months passed since that day when Caroline's room was reopened. Winter had given way to spring, and spring to summer. The Mitchell mansion, which previously seemed a mausoleum of painful memories, now pulsed with a renewed life that manifested itself in the subtlest details. The permanently open windows, the plants that proliferated in every corner, the laughter that occasionally echoed through the corridors. That Sunday morning, Edward observed from the porch, while Olivia and Lauren helped Mrs. Cindy plant flowers in the garden. The three formed a small concentrated group, their heads close together, as they discussed the best arrangement of geranium and begonia seedlings. From time to time, a laugh escaped, usually from Lauren, who had rediscovered a joy that Edward thought lost forever. "Dad, come see," called Olivia, raising her eyes and noticing him on the porch. "We're making a butterfly-shaped garden." Edward smiled, descending the steps to join them. The girls' hands were dirty with soil, their hair tied in identical ponytails, their faces flushed from the morning sun. They looked like children again, not the embittered little adults they had become after Caroline's departure. "It was Lauren's idea," explained Olivia, pointing to the design that was beginning to take shape in the flower bed, to match Mom's and Mrs. Cindy's pendants. "Brilliant," approved Edward, kneeling beside them. "May I help?" The question, so simple, represented a profound change. In recent years, Edward had kept his distance from any activity that might evoke Caroline. Gardening was one of them, a passion his wife shared with their daughters on weekends. Now, however, he felt capable of rediscovering these memories without being devastated by them. "Of course," replied Lauren, handing him a small spade. "You can help with the purple flowers. They'll form the wings." The four worked in harmony for almost 2 hours, conversations flowing naturally, about the plants, about the butterfly's shape, about stories from the past that no longer hurt so much to remember. When they finished, they stepped back a few paces to admire their work. "It's perfect," commented Mrs. Cindy, cleaning her hands on the apron she wore. "Caroline would love it." "She adored butterflies," said Edward, allowing himself to speak of her in the past without feeling that sharp pang of pain. "She said they were symbols of transformation." "Like us," observed Olivia, with wisdom beyond her years. "We're different." "Now," Edward nodded, surprised once again by his daughter's sharp perception. They were all different, transformed by pain, yes, but also by the slow and gradual healing process they had experienced in recent months. "Who wants lemonade?" asked Mrs. Cindy, breaking the moment of contemplation. "I think we deserve it. After so much work." The girls ran animatedly inside, racing to see who would reach the kitchen first. Edward and Mrs. Cindy followed at a calmer pace, a comfortable silence between them. "I never thought I'd see them like this again," commented Edward, his voice low so that only Mrs. Cindy would hear. "So, alive. Children have an incredible capacity for regeneration," she replied. "Like plants. Even after the harshest winter, they bloom again when they receive the proper care." Edward reflected on those words as they entered the kitchen, where Olivia and Lauren were already arguing about who would squeeze the lemons and who would measure the sugar. The metaphor was perfect. His daughters had gone through a long, emotional winter, but now finally they showed signs of spring. Sunday lunch had become an important ritual in recent months. Edward, who previously worked obsessively even on weekends, now made a point of dedicating the entire day to family. That afternoon, as they savoured the chili prepared by Mrs. Cindy, another tradition that had been rescued, conversation flowed cheerfully around the table. "We have a surprise for after lunch," announced Lauren, exchanging complicit looks with her sister. "What kind of surprise?" asked Edward, intrigued. "Secret," replied Olivia, with a mysterious smile. "But it's in Mom's room." Mom's room had gradually transformed over the last few months. It was no longer an untouched sanctuary, but a living space where Caroline's memories were celebrated, not just preserved. The girls had created a scrapbook with old and new photos, had made drawings that now decorated the walls, and occasionally used the space to read or simply talk, as if their mother's presence still lingered there, welcoming and serene. After lunch, Olivia and Lauren led Edward and Mrs. Cindy to the room. The transformation was visible. The heavy, dark curtains had been replaced by light fabrics that filtered the light without completely blocking it. The plants brought from the sunroom had thrived near the windows, and on Caroline's old dressing table there now rested a collection of meaningful small objects, the diary, some jewelry, photographs in simple frames. "Sit on the bed," instructed Olivia, pointing to the freshly arranged quilt. Edward and Mrs. Cindy obeyed, curious. The girls briefly disappeared into the closet and returned carrying something covered by a sheet. "Ready?" asked Lauren, barely containing her excitement. When Edward nodded, the twins simultaneously pulled the sheet, revealing an easel with a painted canvas. It was a family portrait, not a realistic reproduction, but an artistic interpretation clearly made by childish hands, though with surprising talent. In the center was Caroline, her serene face framed by brown hair. Around her were Edward, Olivia, Lauren, and, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Cindy. You painted this?" asked Edward, his voice choked with emotion. "In art classes," confirmed Olivia, proud. "The teacher helped us with the proportions, but the colors and details were our idea." "We put Mrs. Cindy in too," explained Lauren, "because she's part of the family now, and Mom knew her, so it makes sense, doesn't it?" Edward felt tears come to his eyes but didn't try to contain them. They weren't tears just of sadness, but of a deep gratitude for the journey they had traveled, for the way his daughters had found a form of honoring the past while embracing the present. "It's perfect," he said finally. "Absolutely perfect." Mrs. Cindy beside him also had watery eyes. Her hand found Edward's briefly, a touch of shared understanding. "Where do you want to hang it?" she asked the girls. "Right here," replied Lauren, pointing to the wall opposite the bed. "That way, whenever we come in, we'll see all of us together." The simplicity of that childish logic, the need to see the complete family, even if only in an image, touched Edward deeply. He stood up to help the girls position the painting, feeling a strange peace settle in his chest. Later, when the twins went to their room to prepare for bed, Edward found Mrs. Cindy on the porch, contemplating the starry sky. In recent months, they had developed the habit of sharing tea before retiring, a moment of reflection on the day, of planning for the next, of conversations that flowed with an ease that Edward hadn't experienced in a long time. "They surprise me every day," he commented, sitting in the chair beside her. "They're extraordinary girls," agreed Mrs. Cindy. "They have their mother's resilience." "And her stubbornness too," added Edward with a smile. "Especially Olivia." They remained silent for a few minutes, just enjoying the cool night and the jasmine scent coming from the garden. "I received a job offer today," Edward finally said. "A project in Portland to implement a technological management system in public schools." "Sounds interesting," commented Mrs. Cindy. "Will you accept?" "I'm considering it," he replied. "It would be for 3 months, but I could bring the girls. It would be good for them to know another place, to have new experiences." "It certainly would be," agreed Mrs. Cindy. "A change of environment, even temporary, can be very beneficial." Edward hesitated before continuing. "I'd like you to come with us." Mrs. Cindy turned to face him, surprise evident in her gaze. "The girls need you," continued Edward, "and to be honest, I do too. Not just as a nanny, but as part of the family, as Lauren said." A soft smile formed on Mrs. Cindy's lips. "It would be an honor," she replied simply. That night, when checking on the girls before retiring, Edward found them not in their own rooms, but in Caroline's. They had fallen asleep on the large double, bed one on each side, as they used to do when they were younger. Caroline's diary was open between them, as if they had fallen asleep while reading. Edward adjusted the blanket over them, observing their serene faces in sleep. He didn't wake them to send them to their own rooms. There was something deeply right about that scene, as if a circle were closing, as if the room that for so long had been a monument to loss now transformed into a space of comfort and connection. Before leaving, he cast one last look at the portrait on the wall, that simple but powerful representation of a family that had been broken by tragedy, but that had found a way to rebuild itself, to move forward, to transform absence into a different but equally significant presence. The next morning, Edward woke to the sound of laughter coming from downstairs. Going down to the kitchen, he encountered a scene that had become increasingly common. Mrs. Cindy teaching the girls to prepare breakfast. That morning it was pancakes, the batter being skillfully poured into the pan by Lauren, while Olivia cut fruits for the topping. "Good morning," he greeted, feeling a wave of gratitude for that simple, everyday moment that just a few months ago seemed impossible. "Good morning, Dad," the girls responded in unison, but without that mechanical tone that previously characterized their interactions. There was life in their voices now, enthusiasm. "We're making a special breakfast," explained Olivia, "to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" asked Edward, curious. "The trip to Portland," exclaimed Lauren, flipping a pancake in the air with surprising skill. "Mrs. Cindy told us it's going to be amazing." Edward looked at the nanny, who just shrugged with a smile. "They caught me preparing coffee," she explained. "It was impossible to hide." "And when are we going?" asked Olivia, placing a plate full of chopped fruits on the table. "In 2 weeks, if we accept the project," replied Edward, serving himself coffee. "I think it would be good for all of us." "Can we take Mom's diary?" asked Lauren, more serious. "And some photos." "Of course you can," assured Edward. "We'll take everything that's important." The girls exchanged satisfied looks, returning to breakfast preparation with renewed enthusiasm. Edward observed them for a moment, amazed at the transformation they had experienced in recent months. It wasn't as if the pain had completely disappeared. There were still moments, birthdays, special dates, unexpected memories, when Caroline's absence was felt with an almost physical intensity. But they had learned, all of them, to carry this absence in a different way, not as a crushing weight, but as an integral part of who they were and the journey they shared. Mrs. Cindy had been instrumental in this process, not trying to replace Caroline, nor erasing her memory, but helping them find a way to honor her while continuing to live. It was a delicate balance, a dance between the past and present that required constant adjustment, but which gradually became more natural. That Sunday morning marked, in a way, a new chapter in the Mitchell family's story. The trip to Portland represented more than a professional opportunity. It was a symbol of their newly discovered ability to look to the future with hope, to make plans, to imagine possibilities beyond the walls of that house that had been simultaneously refuge and prison for so long later. While helping the girls make a list of things they would like to see in Portland, Edward reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them here. If someone had told him, 6 months before, that his daughters would be laughing, making plans, speaking openly about Caroline without that contained anger that consumed them, he wouldn't have believed it. The transformation seemed almost magical in its completeness, but Edward knew it had been a gradual process, made up of small moments. The diary found, the letter revealed, the room reopened, memories reframed day by day. And at the center of it all was Mrs. Cindy, that unlikely presence who had arrived silently and transformed everything with her quiet wisdom and her invisible connection to the past they were trying to honor. "Dad, can we take the scrapbook we're making?" asked Lauren, interrupting his thoughts. "Of course," he replied, smiling at his daughter, "and perhaps we can add new pages with photos from Portland." "That would be perfect," exclaimed the girl, running to tell her sister. Edward observed her move away, his heart overflowing with an emotion he couldn't completely name. It wasn't just joy, nor just gratitude, but something more complex, deeper, an understanding that they had survived the worst and found a path through the darkness. Mrs. Cindy approached, following his gaze. "They're okay," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Different, but okay." "Thanks to you," replied Edward with sincerity. "No," she corrected with a gentle smile. "Thanks to all of us, and thanks to Caroline, who continues to be present in each of their smiles, in each gesture, in each small victory. Edward nodded, recognizing the truth in those words. Caroline remained, not in the way they would have chosen, but in ways they were learning to value each day. In the personality traits of their daughters, in the stories they shared, in the traditions they kept alive, in the new memories they created, honoring the old ones. When the girls returned, bringing the scrapbook to show the latest edition, the family portrait they had painted, now photographed and pasted on a page decorated with shells and drawn stars, Edward felt a certainty settle in his chest. They would be okay. Not perfect, not without scars, but okay. And in the end, perhaps that was what really mattered. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of enough love to transform it into something that could be carried without destroying them. A love that had survived the unthinkable, and that, like that butterfly newly planted in the garden, would continue to flourish in new and unexpected forms in the years to come. The Mitchell mansion, which for so long had been a scene of silent mourning, now pulsed with a renewed energy, not the frantic energy of denial, nor the artificial calm of repression, but the authentic vitality of life that continues, that transforms, that finds beauty even after the most devastating storm. And at the center of it all was that question that had initially intrigued Edward: why had Mrs. Cindy agreed to stay when all others had given up? The answer, he now realized, was as simple as it was profound: because of love. A love that transcended time and distance, that honored old promises and created new connections, that didn't try to replace what had been lost, but offered something different, equally valuable. It was this love, patient, constant, without fanfare, that had transformed the house and its inhabitants. That had allowed Olivia and Lauren to find their voices again. That had enabled Edward to rediscover his capacity to look to the future. That had allowed Caroline's memory to be honored not as a painful ghost, but as a luminous presence that continued to guide them, even in absence. And so, the Mitchell family's story continued, not as had been planned, not without scars or moments of sadness, but with a new understanding of what it meant to move forward without leaving behind what mattered. An understanding that had been born